15 notorious female serial killers. Some stories are too dark to forget, too chilling to be left buried in the past. They linger, whispering from the shadows, waiting to be told. We often think of serial killers as men, lurking in the night, hunting their victims in alleyways and quiet streets. But monsters do not have a gender. Some of the most ruthless, cold-blooded, and terrifying killers in history were women. Women who shattered expectations, who wore masks of innocence while hiding unimaginable cruelty beneath. They killed for pleasure, for power, for greed. They poisoned, strangled, burned, and butchered. Some did it with a smile, others with a whisper, but all of them left a trail of blood and horror in their wake. Their names have faded, but their crimes still echo in the dark corners of history. Tonight we pull them from the shadows. We recount their twisted tales, relive their reigns of terror, and remind ourselves that evil does not belong to one face, one form, one name. Now we will count to the first. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. She was born into wealth, into privilege, into a family with a name carved into history. But behind the grand walls of her castle, she became something else, something far worse. Elizabeth Báthory, the Countess of Hungary, was one of the most notorious killers the world has ever seen. Her name alone was enough to spread fear. She was no ordinary murderer. She was a predator, a woman whose cruelty was whispered about in hushed tones. The blood of young girls stained her hands, their screams forever trapped in the stone corridors of Chaktish Castle. It began slowly. At first, she was known for her harsh punishments. Servant girls who displeased her would be beaten, humiliated. But that was not enough. Soon she discovered something far more satisfying. She did not just hurt them, she tortured them. She took pleasure in their suffering. She would press needles beneath their fingernails, pour freezing water over their naked bodies, leaving them to freeze to death. And when pain was not enough, she turned to blood. Some say she bathed in it, believing it would keep her young. Others claim she merely delighted in watching it spill. What is certain is that her castle became a slaughterhouse. Her servants became executioners, delivering new victims to her chambers. Girls from the villages would disappear, never to be seen again. For years, her crimes went unchecked. No one dared to challenge a noblewoman, but eventually the rumors grew too loud. The king himself ordered an investigation. When the authorities stormed her castle, they found the unthinkable. Mutilated bodies, some still barely alive, locked in cages, their flesh torn away in strips. Elizabeth Báthory was too powerful to be executed. Instead, she was sealed within her own castle, locked away in a single room, its doors bricked shut. She lived in darkness, alone, with nothing but the echoes of her own cruelty to keep her company. She died there, but her legend never did. Now, we will count up to the second. Amelia Dyer, the angel of death for infants. Amelia Dyer was supposed to be a savior, a woman who took in helpless children, giving them a home, a future. But beneath the kind smile, behind the motherly facade, Amelia Dyer was a butcher. Born in England, she lived in an era where desperate unwed mothers turned to baby farmers, women who, for a price, promised to care for unwanted infants. But Dyer was not interested in care. She was interested in money and in death. At first, she played the role well. She took the infants, accepted payments, and sent reassuring letters to the mothers. But food was expensive and medicine was a burden. So she found a simpler way. She starved them, drugged them with opium-laced syrup, and let their tiny bodies wither in silence. Authorities grew suspicious. She was sent to an asylum, not for murder, but for alleged mental illness. She walked free, and when she returned to baby farming, she changed her method. She took the money, took the child, and within hours ended its life. Strangulation, a ribbon around the neck. No crying, no fuss, just silence. The bodies, now an inconvenience, were tossed into rivers. But rivers do not keep secrets. In 1896, a package washed up on the Thames. Inside, a tiny corpse, a ribbon tied around its neck. It was her signature. It was her downfall. Police followed the trail. They found piles of baby clothes, letters from desperate mothers, and records of hundreds of missing children. Dyer confessed without remorse. She had done this for over 30 years. She was sentenced to hang. When asked for final words, she simply said, "I have nothing to say." The noose tightened and justice was served. Yet even in death, her true number of victims remains unknown. Hundreds, maybe more. The next is the third killer, Nannie Doss, the giggling granny. She had a smile that never faded, a sweet old woman, laughing softly, speaking of love and romance. But behind that laughter, behind those twinkling eyes, lay the heart of a killer. Nannie Doss was born in 1905 in Alabama, raised under the harsh rule of an abusive father. She found her escape in romance magazines, dreaming of a perfect love story. But her love stories always ended in poison and death. Her first husband barely escaped her. They had married young, but he sensed something was wrong. When two of their children died mysteriously, he fled, leaving her behind. It wouldn't be the last time a husband would regret meeting her. The next man she poisoned, then another, and another. By the time she was done, 4 of her husbands were dead, along with her own children, sisters, mother, a grandson, and a mother-in-law. Arsenic was her weapon of choice, slipping it into their food, watching as their bodies weakened, as their faces twisted in agony. She never flinched. She never showed remorse. And when they were gone, she moved on, searching for another perfect love. For decades, she played the role of the grieving widow. No one suspected the sweet, giggling grandmother of murder. Not until her 5th husband, Samuel Doss, fell ill. He survived the first poisoning, but when the doctors examined his body after his sudden death, they found enough arsenic in his system to kill 20 men. The authorities came for her, and finally she confessed. But she didn't cry, didn't beg. She only laughed. She laughed as she described the deaths, laughed when she spoke about watching them die. They called her the giggling granny. She was sentenced to life in prison, no remorse, no regret, just that same eerie smile. She died in 1965, alone, in her prison cell. But even now, when people speak of her, they remember the laughter, the chilling, endless laughter of a woman who killed for love and found joy in death. Now we have reached the 4th one, Jane Toppan, Jolly Jane, the angel of death. She looked like a caretaker, a kind and devoted nurse, a woman of compassion, but behind that comforting presence was a mind consumed by darkness. Jane Toppan was born in Boston in the mid-1800s, abandoned by her father and raised in an orphanage. Her childhood was cruel, lonely, and without love. As she grew older, she sought to fill that void by controlling life and death itself. She became a nurse trusted with the lives of the sick. Hospitals welcomed her with open arms, believing her to be gentle and nurturing. But as the patients lay in their beds, weak and vulnerable, Toppan experimented on them like a scientist with no conscience. Morphine and atropine, her tools of death. She injected one, then the other, playing with dosages, watching as her victims slipped in and out of consciousness. She wanted to see how far she could go, how much she could push before death took hold. And when the moment finally came, when life faded from their eyes, she was there, holding them, whispering, watching. But it wasn't just about killing, it was about pleasure. Toppan admitted she felt a thrill when she climbed into bed with her dying patients, watching the last flicker of their souls disappear. Her victims included elderly patients, close friends, even her landlords. She showed no preference, no mercy. Death to her was an intimate dance, one she wanted to lead. For years, no one suspected the smiling, cheerful nurse. But when entire households began dying under her care, people started asking questions. The bodies were exhumed, poison was found, and Toppan was arrested. Her confession was shocking. She admitted to 31 murders but bragged that the true number was far higher. "I have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived," she declared. Declared insane, she was sent to an asylum instead of the gallows. There she remained until her death, smiling, humming, still lost in the fantasies of death that had consumed her entire life. Jolly Jane, they called her. A woman who found joy in suffering, who turned the act of killing into a twisted art. And as she spent the rest of her days locked away, one question remained. How many more had she truly killed? Now we will count to the fifth. Dorothea Puente, the death house landlady. She was small, frail-looking, with gray curls and a grandmotherly smile. To those who met her, she was a sweet old woman who ran a quiet boarding house in Sacramento. But behind that innocent face lurked something far more sinister. Dorothea Puente was a predator, one who chose her victims carefully, those who would not be missed. Her past was littered with deception. Born in 1929, she had spent her life conning, stealing, and forging checks. But it wasn't enough. She wanted more, and she found the perfect way to get it. She opened a boarding house for the elderly, disabled, and vulnerable. Those whose government checks kept them afloat, but whose voices were rarely heard. At first, she simply stole their money. Then she realized something: dead men tell no tales. One by one, her tenants vanished. Some complained of illness. Others simply disappeared overnight. But their social security checks kept coming, signed over to Dorothea. She poisoned them slowly, mixing sedatives into their food and drinks. When they grew too weak, she finished them off. Some she suffocated, others she drugged until their hearts stopped. Their bodies buried in her backyard while she welcomed her next victim. For years, no one suspected her. Even when neighbors noticed strange smells, even when social workers raised concerns, she played her part well. Then the police came looking for a missing tenant. They dug in her garden and found a human leg sticking out of the earth. Then another and another. In total, they uncovered 7 bodies, 7 souls who trusted her. She was arrested, but even then, she looked the part. A confused, frail old woman. But in court, the truth was laid bare. The jury found her guilty of multiple murders. She was sentenced to life in prison. As she was led away, she turned to the cameras and smiled, softly, sweetly, like a grandmother watching over her family. She died in prison in 2011. But even now, when people walk past her house on F Street, some say they still feel a presence, a whisper of horrors buried beneath the ground. The death house landlady, the woman who smiled as she stole lives. Now it's the 6th one, Aileen Wuornos, the monster who walked among us. She was called a monster, a heartless killer, a woman without remorse. But her story was darker than anyone could have imagined. Aileen Wuornos was born into a world that never wanted her. Abandoned by her mother, raised by an abusive grandfather, she learned that survival meant doing whatever it took. By 13, she was selling her body for food and shelter. By her 20s, she was a drifter, moving from place to place, selling herself to men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. But one day, she decided she would no longer be the prey. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos killed 7 men. They picked her up on highways expecting sex. Instead, they met a bullet. She shot them at close range, emptied their pockets, stole their cars. To some, she was a cold-blooded killer. To others, she was a victim who had snapped, a woman who had spent her life being used, beaten, discarded, until she decided to fight back. Her first victim, Richard Mallory, had a history of sexual assault. Wuornos later claimed he had tried to rape her, and in self-defense, she killed him. But the murders didn't stop there. One by one, she lured men in and executed them. The police caught her when she and her lover, Tyria Moore, were found driving a stolen car. Her trial was a spectacle. The media vilified her. The prosecution destroyed her. And Wuornos? She stared down the jury, unblinking, as she was sentenced to death. She never begged for mercy. In 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were chilling. "I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." Then the poison entered her veins and she was gone. But the debate remains. Was she a monster, or was she a woman pushed too far? Even now her story lingers, haunting the highways where she once walked, a ghost forever caught between predator and prey. Now we will count to the 7th. Juana Barraza, the old lady killer. In Mexico City, where the streets never sleep, a killer hunted the most unexpected victims, the elderly, grandmothers who had lived long enough to believe they were safe. By day, Juana Barraza was a professional wrestler, known as La Dama del Silencio, the Silent Lady. By night, she became something far worse. Born into suffering, she was sold as a child by her own mother, forced to endure abuse. She learned that trust was a weapon, that kindness was a lie. She turned her rage toward those who reminded her of the mother who betrayed her, elderly women, alone and vulnerable. Between the late 1990s and early 2000s, elderly women across Mexico City were strangled in their homes. A stethoscope, a pair of tights, electrical cords, whatever she could find, she used to silence them forever. The police were baffled. Witnesses described a tall, broad-shouldered figure. Many believed the killer was a man. No one imagined it was a woman, that the same hands that fought in the ring were the ones that had stolen over 40 lives. She gained their trust, pretending to be a nurse or social worker. And when they let her in, she turned on them. The city was gripped with fear. Doors remained locked. Families took turns staying home to protect their grandmothers. Yet she kept killing. Her downfall came in 2006 when she was caught fleeing the home of her final victim. A witness saw her and called the police. In her home, officers found stolen ID cards and trophies from her victims. The trial was swift, the evidence undeniable. She was sentenced to 759 years in prison, a punishment so severe it sent a clear message. Mexico City would never forget. Now she rots in a cell, her days of wrestling and murder over. But the city remembers. The families who buried their loved ones will always remember La Mata Viejitas, the old lady killer. And in the silence of her prison, perhaps she finally understands what it means to be truly alone. Now we will count to the 8. Leonardo Cianciulli, the soap maker of Correggio. In the quiet town of Correggio, Italy, there lived a woman who hid a horror unlike any other behind the walls of her modest home. Her name was Leonardo Cianciulli, and she was a mother, a wife, a neighbor. But beneath the surface, she was something far worse. She was a killer, and her victims did not just die, they were transformed. Born in 1894, Cianciulli's life was riddled with misfortune. She believed she had been cursed by her own mother, doomed to endure a life of suffering. Her belief in dark omens and supernatural forces consumed her. And when she heard that her beloved son was to be drafted into the Italian army, she became desperate. She convinced herself that only blood could protect him, that only human sacrifice could shield him from death. And so, she turned to murder. Her victims were all women, each lured into her home with promises of a better future. She told them she could help them find husbands, new beginnings, safety, and they trusted her. The first was Faustina Setti, a lonely woman looking for love. Cianciulli offered to help, instructing her to write letters to her family, telling them she was leaving town. Then, as Faustina stood in her kitchen, excited for her fresh start, Cianciulli struck. She drugged her, slit her throat, and collected her blood in a basin. But death was not enough. She chopped Faustina's body into pieces, boiled them in a pot, and mixed them with caustic soda. Flesh melted away, bones dissolved, and what remained was a thick, foul-smelling sludge. Then she did something even more unthinkable. She took the congealed remains and turned them into soap. She made tea cakes from the blood, serving them to her friends, her neighbors, even her own family. And it did not stop there. 2 more women followed, Francesca Soavi and Virginia Cacioppo, each murdered, each rendered down to nothing more than bars of soap and baked goods. But greed became her downfall. Virginia Cacioppo was well known, and her sudden disappearance raised questions. Her sister grew suspicious and reported Cianciulli to the authorities. When police arrived at her home, they found the tools of her dark craft: blood-stained basins, large cooking pots, and remnants of her victims. She confessed without hesitation, recounting her crimes with chilling ease. I threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, and stirred until everything dissolved into a thick, dark mush. I drained it into several buckets and emptied it in a nearby septic tank. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in an asylum. She died behind bars, her story forever etched into history as one of the most disturbing accounts of murder and madness. The soap maker of Correggio, a woman who believed she could wash away fate with the blood of the innocent. Now we will count to the ninth. Myra Hindley, the woman who became the face of evil. There are killers whose crimes are so unspeakable, so horrific, that their names become forever etched in the minds of those who hear them. Myra Hindley was one of them. She was not an outcast. She was not a loner. She was not broken by childhood trauma. She had choices, and she chose evil. Born in 1942 in England, Hindley seemed like any other ordinary girl. But when she met Ian Brady, a man obsessed with torture and murder, she became something else, something far darker. He was her god, and she was willing to do anything for him. Together, they became the Moors murderers, a name that would forever haunt Britain. Between 1963 and 1965, Hindley and Brady lured children into their car, offering them a ride, a promise of something innocent. But there was nothing innocent about what followed. They took their victims to the empty, desolate moors where no one could hear the screams. There they raped, tortured, and murdered them. They photographed their suffering. They recorded the agony. They buried their tiny bodies beneath the cold, unfeeling earth. One of the victims, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, was forced to pose for disturbing photographs before she was killed. A tape recording was later found, her voice pleading, crying for her mother. It was played in court, and even the most hardened officers wept. For years, the police had no idea who was responsible. But evil is never careful forever. Hindley's own brother-in-law witnessed Brady murdering a young man with an axe. That was all it took. The police stormed their home, uncovering evidence so vile that even seasoned detectives could barely speak of it. The trial was a spectacle. Hindley sat there, stone-faced, emotionless, as if she had not helped lure children to their deaths, as if she had not listened to their final screams and felt nothing. She was sentenced to life in prison, and though Brady never expressed remorse, Hindley tried to rewrite her legacy. She claimed she had been manipulated, that she was just another victim. She begged for freedom. But Britain never forgave her. She became the most hated woman in the country, her name synonymous with cruelty. She died in prison in 2002, and no one mourned. But the moors remain. The graves still whisper of the horrors buried beneath them. And every so often, when the wind howls through the hills, people wonder, how many victims still lie undiscovered, beneath the dirt, beneath the sky, beneath the weight of history? Now we will count to the 10th. Sharon Kinney, the woman who killed and vanished. Sharon Kinney, born in 1939 in Missouri, was a woman of charm, beauty, and deadly intent. Her first victim was her husband, James Kinney. She claimed their 2-year-old daughter accidentally shot him, but inconsistencies in the evidence raised suspicions. Without proof, she walked free. Her next victim was Patricia Jones, the wife of her lover. Found in the woods with 3 bullets to her chest, Patricia's death led to Kinney's arrest. Convicted and sentenced to life, Kinney's conviction was overturned due to a technicality. Before a retrial could conclude, she fled to Mexico. In Mexico, her violent streak continued. After a heated argument with another lover, she shot him. Arrested and sentenced to 10 years, she managed to escape, vanishing without a trace. Decades have passed, and her whereabouts remain a mystery. Some speculate she assumed a new identity in South America. Others believe she's dead. Sharon Kinney's story is one of deception, violence, and evasion. A woman who killed, manipulated the system, and disappeared like a ghost. Her victims' families were left without closure, and her legend lingers. When tales surface of a solitary woman who never stays long in one place, some wonder, is it Sharon Kinney, still out there, still running, still hiding her dark secrets? The next is number 11. Lavinia Fisher, the murderous mistress of the inn. Lavinia Fisher's name lingers in the shadows of American history, whispered as the first female serial killer. In the early 1800s, she and her husband, John Fisher, ran the 6-Mile Wayfarer House, an inn near Charleston, South Carolina. Travelers seeking rest often met a grim fate. Lavinia, charming and beautiful, welcomed them with poisoned tea. As the victims weakened, she and John struck, strangling, stabbing, or dropping them through a hidden trapdoor into a pit below. For years, the disappearances went unnoticed, but whispers spread. warning travelers to avoid the inn. One night, John Peoples arrived. Sensing danger, he pretended to drink the tea and avoided the bed. When the trapdoor beneath it opened, he fled, alerting authorities. The police raided the inn, uncovering countless bodies buried on the grounds. Lavinia and John were arrested and sentenced to hang. At the gallows, Lavinia refused to repent. Dressed in a white gown, she mocked the crowd and the priest, shouting, "If any of you have a message for the devil, give it to me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly." She died unrepentant, her legacy etched in darkness. Some say her spirit still haunts Charleston, lingering near the gallows where she was hanged. A woman who lured men to their deaths, Lavinia Fisher remains a chilling reminder of the monsters who walk among us, their stories forever tied to the shadows they left behind. Now, the next is number 12. Carol M. Bundy, the woman who loved a killer. Carol M. Bundy wasn't always a killer, but her encounter with Doug Clark in the late 1970s sealed her fate. Clark, a charming drifter with a thirst for death, shared his dark fantasies with her, fantasies of watching life drain from a woman's eyes. Instead of fleeing, Carol fell in love. Together, they became the Sunset Strip Killers, preying on young women in Los Angeles. Clark pulled the trigger while Carol cleaned up, disposing of bodies and erasing evidence. But she wanted more, to prove herself. She lured Jack Murray, a country singer she once idolized, into her van, shot him twice, and decapitated him, carrying his head as a trophy. Eventually, her guilt spilled out. She confessed to a co-worker, leading to Clark's arrest and death sentence. Carol claimed she was manipulated, but the courts saw through her lies, sentencing her to 52 years to life. She died in prison in 2003, but the shadows of their crimes still haunt Los Angeles. Deborah Brown's story is one of corrupted innocence. A quiet, obedient woman, she might have lived an ordinary life if not for Alton Coleman. Meeting him in 1984, she was drawn into his darkness, becoming his accomplice in a 6-state killing spree. Together, they raped, tortured, and murdered indiscriminately. They strangled 9-year-old Tamika Turks, left a young girl and her grandmother to die in a car trunk, and tortured a woman for hours before killing her. Brown wasn't just a bystander. She actively participated, holding victims down and choosing targets. When caught, Coleman was sentenced to death, while Brown initially faced the same fate. However, arguments that she was brainwashed spared her life, commuting her sentence to life without parole. The families of their victims never forgave her. Brown remains in prison, a woman who followed a killer into hell and never looked back. Both Bundy and Brown serve as chilling reminders of how ordinary people can be twisted into monsters, their stories etched into the annals of crime. The next is number 13, Judy Buenoano, the Black Widow who left no survivors. Judy Buenoano, born Judius Welty in 1943, masked her darkness behind the facade of a devoted wife and mother. A cold, calculating mind honed by a troubled childhood, she saw dollar signs in those closest to her. Her first victim, husband James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant, died slowly from arsenic poisoning. She collected his life insurance and moved on. Her next target, Bobby Joe Morris, suffered the same fate: arsenic poisoning, organ failure, and death. Judy claimed another payout, but her most heinous crime was against her son, Michael. She poisoned him for years, leaving him paralyzed. During a canoe trip, she capsized the boat, letting his leg braces drag him underwater as she watched him drown. Her final attempt, fiancé John Gentry, survived a car bombing meant to kill him. He alerted authorities, who uncovered her trail of arsenic-laced victims. Exhumations revealed her crimes: husbands, lovers, and her own son, all poisoned for profit. Arrested and convicted, Judy showed no remorse. On March 30th, 1998, she was executed in Florida's electric chair. Her last meal, broccoli, asparagus, and tea. Known as the Black Widow, her legacy is one of shattered lives and stolen futures, a chilling reminder of the monsters among us. Now we will count to the 14th, Miyuki Ishikawa. In the aftermath of World War II, Japan was in ruins. Poverty spread, and families struggled to survive. Among them was Miyuki Ishikawa, a midwife who saw newborns as burdens, not lives. She called it mercy. She believed children born into poverty had no future, that death was kinder than suffering. At first, she let them die of neglect, starving them, depriving them of care. But soon the numbers grew. More infants came, and she needed a faster method. With accomplices, she murdered over 100 infants, though the true number may be far higher. The bodies were discarded like trash, hidden away. Parents were told lies or too afraid to ask questions, and for years no one stopped her. It wasn't suspicion that led to her downfall. It was a horrific discovery. A mass grave of infants was uncovered. Tiny bodies, lifeless and forgotten. The truth could no longer be ignored. She was arrested, put on trial, but her punishment? A mere 4 years in prison, over 100 infants gone, and she walked free. Her name is rarely spoken, her crimes often forgotten. But among Japan's history of horror, Miyuki Ishikawa remains one of the deadliest women to have ever lived. Now we will count to the last one. Deborah Brown. Deborah Brown was once an ordinary woman, quiet, obedient, and never in trouble. But that changed when she met Alton Coleman. She was one of 11 children, with an IQ ranging from 59 to 74, making her easily manipulated. Coleman, a career criminal, was already wanted for multiple sex crimes when they met in 1983. Brown, engaged to another man at the time, left everything behind to follow him into darkness. Together, they became a murderous pair, embarking on a killing spree across 6 states in the Midwest. 8 people died, many of them women and children, subjected to brutal assaults before their deaths. Brown wasn't just an accomplice, she participated. She helped restrain victims, she watched as Coleman tortured and killed, and in some cases, she joined in the violence. Their spree lasted months, leaving terror in their wake. But in 1984, the law caught up with them. They were arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Brown's defense claimed she was brainwashed, that Coleman had dominated her, turning her into something she never was before. Her sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. She remains behind bars, a woman who could have lived an ordinary life, but instead chose to follow a monster into the abyss. These were the 15 women, each a killer with unique motives and methods. Money, power, pleasure. Ruthless, calculated, merciless. History records their horrors, but evil persists, hidden, waiting. Among us, women smile, greet neighbors, yet behind closed doors, plot their next move. Monsters don't lurk under beds. They walk beside us unseen. Thanks for watching. If you love true crime and chilling real-life stories, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Like, share, and join us as we uncover the darkest secrets in history.